The ledger discovered in the ruins of Bellwood Plantation in 1923 contained an entry that Louisiana state archivists initially refused to authenticate. Dated November 1847, the notation described a female slave purchased for $8, marked in the register with a single word that appeared again and again in subsequent entries over the next decade. Monster. By 1857, that same woman would own every acre of Bellwood's 3,000 acres, control a fortune worth over $200,000, and preside over the deaths of 4 white men whose bodies were never properly explained. The official inquest, sealed by order of the Louisiana Supreme Court, concluded only that certain events at Bellwood Plantation exceeded the capacity of ordinary legal frameworks to address. What happened there wasn't a love story, wasn't a tale of forbidden passion or unlikely redemption. It was something far more calculated, far more deliberate, and far more disturbing than anyone in Ascension Parish dared to speak aloud, even decades after the woman they called the Abominable One had disappeared into history. Before we descend into the shadows of Bellwood, where ambition wore the face of survival and revenge disguised itself as mercy, make sure you're subscribed to the Sealed Room. Hit that notification bell, because the stories we uncover here are the ones that were buried for a reason. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's begin. The transaction that would eventually consume Bellwood Plantation took place on a suffocating October afternoon in 1847 at a slave market on the outskirts of Donaldsonville, Louisiana. The auction block stood in the shadow of a massive oak tree whose branches seemed to absorb the light, casting everything beneath it in perpetual twilight even at midday. Augustin Mercier, owner of Bellwood and one of the wealthiest planters in Ascension Parish, had not intended to buy anyone that day. He had come merely to observe prices, to gauge the market for the 60 enslaved people he was considering selling off to cover gambling debts that had accumulated faster than even his lucrative sugar cane operation could absorb. The auctioneer, a man named Thibault who conducted sales with the enthusiasm of someone selling livestock, which in legal terms was precisely what he was doing, brought out the usual parade of field hands, domestic workers, and children whose value was calculated by their potential rather than their present. Augustin watched with the detached interest of a man who had attended hundreds of such sales, noting prices, assessing quality, calculating margins with the practiced efficiency of someone who viewed human beings primarily as units of production. Then the woman was brought out, and the entire atmosphere shifted. She wore a burlap sack that covered her head and upper body, unusual enough to draw immediate attention from the crowd of planters and traders who had been growing restless in the heat. Thibault's voice, which had been maintaining a steady patter of salesmanship, dropped to something quieter, almost apologetic. "Gentlemen," he said, "this next item comes with full disclosure of defects. I'm bringing her out only because her current owner insists on disposal. I cannot in good conscience recommend purchase, but the law requires I offer her for sale." Someone in the crowd called out demanding to see what was under the sack. Thibault hesitated, then gestured to his assistant. The burlap was removed. The woman standing on the auction block appeared to be in her early 20s, approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall, with a strong frame that suggested years of physical labor. But it was her face and visible skin that caused several men in the crowd to turn away, that made others whisper prayers or curses depending on their disposition. The entire left side of her face and neck was covered in severe burn scars, the kind that came from prolonged contact with fire. The scarring continued down her left arm and presumably across her torso, though her rough cotton dress covered most of her body. The scars were old, fully healed, but they had healed badly, creating a landscape of twisted, discolored tissue that pulled her left eye into a permanent slight squint and dragged the corner of her mouth downward in what looked like a perpetual expression of contempt. Her right side was unmarked, showing smooth, dark skin and features that might have been considered attractive in other circumstances. The contrast between the two halves created a disturbing visual effect, as though two different people had been merged together incorrectly, as though whoever had created her had lost interest halfway through and left the project unfinished. "What happened to her?" someone asked. "Fire," Thibault replied shortly. "Childhood accident on her previous owner's property. The scarring makes her unsuitable for housework where she might frighten guests or children. Field work only. And even then, other slaves refuse to work near her. Consider her essentially worthless except perhaps for the most basic labor in complete isolation." "Can she work?" Augustin heard himself asking. The question surprised him. He had not intended to speak. "Physically, yes. She's healthy enough beneath the scarring. But the problems she creates among other workers make her more trouble than she's worth. Her current owner paid $60 for her 5 years ago before the extent of the scarring was apparent. He's willing to take a complete loss just to be rid of her." "What's her name?" "Celeste, though most call her other things. She doesn't speak much. Might be mute, though I've heard her make sounds, so perhaps she simply chooses silence." "Can she understand instructions?" "As far as I know, yes. She follows orders when they're clear, doesn't cause trouble beyond her appearance. Just stands there looking like something from a nightmare and making everyone uncomfortable." Augustin studied the woman more carefully. She had not moved or reacted during this entire exchange, standing perfectly still on the auction block with her eyes, one fully open and one perpetually narrowed, fixed on some point in the middle distance. Her posture suggested neither submission nor defiance, just a profound absence of expectation, as though she had learned long ago that what happened to her was entirely beyond her control, and that preserving energy by not reacting was the most rational response to an irrational situation. "I'll give you $5, Augustin said. The crowd murmured, surprised that anyone would bid at all. Thibault looked relieved to have any offer. "I'll take 8 if you're willing," he said. "That at least covers my commission and transport costs." "Done," Augustin replied. The transaction was completed in less than 10 minutes. Celeste was removed from the auction block, her ownership transferred through paperwork that described her as one Negro female, approximately 23 years, severely disfigured by fire, sold as is with no guarantees regarding temperament or working capacity. Augustin had her loaded into the back of his wagon, along with supplies he had purchased in town, and began the 12-mile journey back to Bellwood. He did not speak to her during the ride, and she did not attempt to speak to him. When they arrived at Bellwood just before sunset, the plantation spread out before them like a small kingdom. 3,000 acres of prime sugar cane land running along both sides of Bayou Lafarge, with the main house, a French colonial structure with wide galleries and imported marble, positioned on a slight rise that allowed views across the entire operation. The sugar mill occupied its own complex of buildings near the river, where steam power and enslaved labor transformed harvested cane into the white gold that had made the Mercier family wealthy for 3 generations. 240 people lived and worked at Bellwood, most in the rows of cabins that stretched behind the main house, arranged in precise lines that reflected Augustin's father's obsession with order and efficiency. Augustin was 31 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and widely regarded in Ascension Parish society as brilliant but dangerously unpredictable. He had inherited Bellwood 3 years earlier when his father died of yellow fever, along with debts that would have destroyed a less capable manager, and a reputation for harsh discipline that even other planters considered excessive. Under Augustine's management, Bellwood had increased production by 40% while simultaneously developing a reputation for mysterious accidents and unexplained disappearances that made hiring overseers increasingly difficult. People whispered that Augustine Mercier had inherited his grandfather's cruelty, along with his plantation, that he conducted experiments on the enslaved workers that went beyond even the casually horrific norms of plantation discipline. Whether these rumors were true or merely the exaggerations that always accumulate around isolated men with absolute power over others remained unclear. Augustine did nothing to either confirm or dispel speculation, seeming to find the fear itself more useful than any specific reputation. He brought Celeste to the overseer's house, where Jacques Robichaux, a hard man who had worked at Bellwood for 15 years, was reviewing harvest schedules by lamplight. "I've brought someone for the isolation cabin," Augustine said without preamble. "She'll work the far western fields where the drainage is poor. Alone, with daily quotas delivered each morning. No interaction with other workers. You're responsible for ensuring compliance." Jacques looked at Celeste, his expression shifting from curiosity to revulsion as the lamplight illuminated her scarred face. "Christ, what is that?" "That is property I just purchased. That is a worker who will clear and maintain the western acreage. That is none of your concern beyond ensuring she completes assigned tasks. Am I clear, Jacques?" "Yes, sir, but the others will talk. They'll create problems if they think you're bringing cursed things onto the property. Then you'll manage those concerns with whatever methods you find necessary. I'm not interested in superstitions or complaints. I'm interested in whether the western fields can be made productive, and this worker costs me almost nothing while potentially generating value from land we're currently wasting." Jacques knew better than to argue further. He took Celeste to the isolation cabin, a structure originally built as punishment quarters for enslaved people who required separation from the general population. It was 8 feet by 10 feet, constructed of cypress wood with gaps between the boards that would let in rain and cold, containing nothing but a straw pallet and a bucket. The cabin sat nearly half a mile from the main quarters, surrounded by scrub vegetation and the cypress swamp that marked Bellwood's western boundary. "This is where you'll stay," Jacques told Celeste, lighting a small oil lamp and hanging it from a ceiling hook. "You'll get rations delivered each morning along with your work assignment. You complete the work, you get fed. You fail to complete the work, you don't eat. You cause any trouble and Mr. Mercier will deal with you personally, and trust me, you don't want that. Understand?" Celeste looked at him directly for the first time. Her right eye, unaffected by scarring, was remarkably clear and intelligent, the kind of eye that suggested far more awareness than her circumstances implied she should possess. She nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement that somehow conveyed both complete understanding and absolute indifference to threats. Jacques left quickly, unnerved by something he couldn't quite articulate about her presence. That first night, Celeste sat in the isolation cabin and listened to the sounds of the swamp, the chorus of frogs and insects, the distant splash of alligators moving through water, the rustling of things unnamed moving through vegetation just beyond the cabin walls. She had survived 23 years through adaptability, through making herself useful while remaining invisible, through learning to read situations and exploit the narrow margins of agency available to someone considered less than human by the legal and social structures governing every aspect of her existence. The fire that had scarred her had happened when she was 7 years old, a punishment for breaking a water pitcher that had escalated when her screams attracted attention and embarrassed the overseer who had held her face near the kitchen fire to teach her carefulness. The burns should have killed her, infection should have finished what flame had started, but she had survived through sheer stubborn refusal to give her tormentors the satisfaction of her death. The scarring had transformed her from a child who might have been trained for housework into something that could only be hidden away, used for the hardest labor where appearance didn't matter, sold at loss when even that limited utility seemed too contaminated by the discomfort her presence created. She had learned to use that discomfort strategically. People who found her appearance disturbing also avoided looking at her directly, avoided spending time near her, and therefore failed to notice what she was actually doing or thinking. In 23 years, Celeste had taught herself to read by watching a plantation owner's children receive lessons she observed through kitchen windows. She had learned mathematics by mentally tracking inventory counts and calculating shortages. She had studied power by watching how it operated, who wielded it, and what patterns of behavior either consolidated control or created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by those patient enough to wait for opportunity. She had also learned that the world was profoundly unjust, that justice and power rarely aligned, and that survival required abandoning any expectation that virtue would be rewarded or that suffering would be acknowledged as meaningful by those causing it. The question she had been asking herself for years was simple. What happens when someone invisible decides to become visible? What happens when someone considered monstrous accepts that designation and uses it deliberately? What happens when patience stops being passive endurance and becomes active strategy? At Bellwood Plantation, she would finally discover the answers. The work Augustine assigned her was brutal by any standard. The western fields had been left fallow for years because the soil was clay-heavy and poorly drained, requiring extensive ditching and amendment before sugar cane could grow successfully. Celeste spent her days digging drainage channels, clearing scrub vegetation, and hauling loads of sand and organic matter to improve soil composition. It was work that would normally require multiple people. Augustine was essentially testing whether she would die attempting it, which would cost him $8, or whether she possessed unusual stamina, in which case she would have paid for herself within a single harvest season. Celeste completed every assignment. Not quickly, not easily, but with mechanical efficiency that suggested she had calculated exactly how much effort was required to meet minimums, while preserving enough energy to survive until the next day. Jacques, checking her progress weekly, found himself reluctantly impressed by the amount of work she accomplished alone. After 3 months, the western fields showed visible improvement. The drainage channels functioned properly during heavy rains, and preliminary plantings of test crops indicated the soil would support cane within another growing season. Augustine noticed, because Augustine noticed everything that affected Bellwood's profitability. In February 1848, he walked out to the western fields personally, something he rarely did for routine inspections. Celeste was working when he arrived, using a short-handled hoe to break up compacted soil, her movements rhythmic and efficient despite obvious exhaustion. She did not stop or acknowledge his presence until he spoke. "You're exceeding expectations," he said, studying the improved acreage with the calculating gaze of someone assessing investment returns. "The western fields may actually become productive, which would add significant value to operations here." Celeste straightened slightly, but did not turn to face him. "The soil composition is wrong for immediate planting," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse but perfectly articulate, carrying an accent that suggested education beyond what her circumstances should have permitted. Augustine's attention sharpened immediately. "You speak when speech serves a purpose, and you understand agriculture. I understand what I've observed. The cane you're growing in the eastern fields requires specific pH balance and nutrient availability. This western soil is too acidic and lacks sufficient phosphorus. The drainage improvements help, but without soil amendment, you'll get poor germination and weak growth." "Where did you learn that?" "By watching failures and asking why they failed." Augustine walked closer, positioning himself where he could see her face directly. Most people found the scarring so disturbing they avoided this proximity. But Augustin studied her with the same analytical detachment he applied to machinery or crop yield data. "Who taught you to read?" he asked quietly. "No one taught me, I taught myself." "Why?" "Because knowledge is the only thing that can't be taken away once you acquire it. Because understanding how systems function gives you power even when you have no authority. And because I decided long ago that I would not let circumstances determine the limits of my capability." A long silence followed, broken only by the sounds of the swamp and the distant steam whistle from the sugar mill, marking the end of the morning work shift. "What else can you do?" Augustin asked finally. "I can calculate compound interest and depreciation. I can read French as well as English. I understand basic principles of mechanics and chemistry, and I know enough about medicine and poison to kill or cure, depending on intent and dosage." The last item was delivered in the same neutral tone as the others, but Augustin caught the implication immediately. "Are you threatening me?" "No, I'm demonstrating value. You purchased me for $8 because I'm considered worthless. But worthlessness is a form of invisibility, and invisible things can accomplish tasks that visible things cannot. I'm offering to be useful to you in ways beyond physical labor, if you're intelligent enough to recognize the opportunity." "And what would you want in return?" "Not to spend the rest of my life digging ditches in a swamp," Celeste replied. "Not to die from exhaustion or accident or deliberate cruelty before I've had the chance to demonstrate that I'm significantly more capable than my appearance suggests. Beyond that, I'll negotiate once I've proven my worth." Augustin should have been offended by the presumption in her tone. Should have reminded her of exactly what she was under the law, and what he was entitled to do with or to her, without any legal or social consequences whatsoever. Instead, he found himself intrigued by the sheer audacity of someone in her position, making demands rather than pleas, stating terms rather than begging for mercy. "Come to the main house tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll determine whether your claimed capabilities are genuine or merely delusion created by desperation." He left without waiting for response, walking back across the improved western fields toward the plantation house, already calculating how this unexpected development might be exploited. Celeste arrived at the main house before dawn, waiting on the bottom step of the rear gallery, where enslaved domestic workers entered. She had washed as well as possible with the limited water available at the isolation cabin, but her clothing, the same rough cotton dress she had worn for months, was stained with soil and sweat. The scarring on her face looked more pronounced in the gray pre-dawn light, the twisted tissue catching shadows in ways that emphasized every irregular contour. Marguerite, the cook who managed the kitchen and wielded considerable informal authority among the house staff, opened the door and physically recoiled when she saw Celeste standing there. "Sweet Mary and Joseph, what are you?" Celeste met her gaze with that unnerving direct stare that seemed to see more than was comfortable. "I'm here on Master Mercier's orders. He said nothing to me about bringing something like you into the main house. You stay right there, don't move, don't touch anything." Marguerite disappeared inside, her rapid French-inflected English carrying through the kitchen, as she complained to whoever would listen about cursed things and bad omens and masters who made decisions without consulting people who actually had to maintain household order. 20 minutes passed. The sky lightened gradually, turning from black to deep blue to the pale gray that preceded sunrise. Other domestic workers arrived for their shifts, each one stopping short when they saw Celeste, each one giving her the widest possible berth as they entered the house. Finally, Augustin appeared, already dressed despite the early hour, carrying what looked like account ledgers and correspondence. "Come," he said without preamble, leading her not into the kitchen but through a side entrance directly into his private study. The room was exactly what Celeste would have expected from observing Augustin during their brief previous encounters. Books lined two walls, floor to ceiling in French, English, and what looked like Latin. A massive desk dominated the center, covered with papers organized into precise stacks that suggested someone who dealt with chaos by imposing rigid systems upon it. Agricultural equipment diagrams competed for wall space, with what appeared to be anatomical drawings and chemical formulas. A locked cabinet in the corner almost certainly contained things that explained some of the rumors about Bellwood's master. Augustin gestured to a small table near the window where he had laid out several items. Account ledgers from 3 different plantations, a business letter in French, a mathematical problem involving compound interest calculations, and a broken mechanical device that looked like part of the sugar mill's refining apparatus. "Demonstrate your claimed capabilities," he said, settling into his desk chair with a glass of brandy despite the early hour. "You have until noon. If you're as useful as you suggested, we'll discuss new arrangements. If you've exaggerated or lied, you'll return to the western fields and we'll pretend this conversation never happened." Celeste approached the table, moving with careful deliberation, aware that every gesture was being evaluated. She started with the ledgers, spending nearly an hour reviewing entries and making notes on a blank sheet of paper Augustin provided. Then she moved to the French letter, reading it twice before drafting a response. The mathematical problem took 15 minutes. The broken mechanism took longest, requiring her to disassemble it completely, identify the failed component, and sketch a replacement part with precise measurements. By 11 o'clock, she had completed everything. Augustin had continued his own work during this time, occasionally glancing up to observe her progress, but mostly ignoring her presence with the studied indifference of someone conducting an experiment that required minimal interference. When she finished, he set aside his papers and reviewed her work systematically. The ledger analysis identified 3 instances of systematic embezzlement, 2 by overseers who were skimming profits through false reporting of crop damage, and 1 by a factor in New Orleans who was underreporting sale prices while pocketing the difference. The amounts were small enough to escape casual notice, but large enough to accumulate into significant losses over time. Celeste had not only identified the discrepancies, but had calculated total losses and suggested specific auditing procedures to confirm the theft and prevent future occurrences. The French letter was from a competitor inquiring about purchasing a portion of Bellwood's sugar production. Celeste's drafted response politely declined, while providing just enough information about production capacity to make the competitor believe Bellwood was operating at full capacity, when in fact significant expansion was possible. The strategic misdirection was subtle enough to seem like ordinary business correspondence rather than deliberate deception. The mathematical problem, designed to be time-consuming even for someone with good arithmetic skills, had been solved correctly with work shown in a way that demonstrated genuine understanding rather than lucky guessing. The mechanical device's solution was perhaps most impressive. She had not only identified the failed bearing, but had recognized that the failure was caused by a design flaw rather than normal wear, suggesting a modification that would prevent future breakdowns. Augustin set down the last paper and looked at Celeste for a long moment. "Where did you really learn these things?" he asked quietly. "No one teaches this level of skill to slaves. Even house slaves with education rarely reach this competency. So either you're extraordinarily gifted at self-instruction, or you're not what you appear to be." "I'm exactly what I appear to be," Celeste replied, "a slave with burned scars who has been considered worthless for most of her life. What I am additionally is patient, observant, and capable of learning from any source available. I've stolen education from every situation I've encountered. I've watched and listened and memorized and practiced. I've had 16 years since the fire to develop these capabilities, because no one watched me closely enough to notice or care what I was doing with time between work assignments. Why reveal yourself now? Why not continue hiding these abilities? Because hiding them indefinitely serves no purpose beyond survival, and survival without purpose is just slower death. I'm 23 years old. If I continue as I am, I'll be worked to death in those western fields within 5 years. If I demonstrate value that you can exploit, I might live longer and accomplish something beyond merely existing until I don't. And you think I'll treat you better than others have. I think you'll use me more intelligently than others have, which amounts to the same thing from my perspective. You're not sentimental about slavery. You don't dress it up with paternalist mythology about caring for inferior races. You see it clearly as an economic system built on violence and exploitation. That clarity makes you more reliable than masters who convince themselves they're benevolent, because I know exactly where I stand with you. Augustine stood and walked to the window, looking out across Bellwood's grounds where the morning work shifts were already well underway. If I employ you for administrative and technical work, he said slowly, there will be problems. The house staff will object. The overseers will consider it threatening to their authority. Other planters will see it as evidence of eccentricity or worse. Managing those complications will require energy and attention I could otherwise dedicate to more productive matters. Then the question is whether the value I provide exceeds the cost of those complications, Celeste replied. Based on what I just demonstrated, I can identify theft and inefficiency that's costing you thousands of dollars annually. I can handle correspondence in multiple languages. I can solve mechanical and logistical problems that currently require you to hire expensive consultants. I can work any hours you require without complaint or expectation of compensation, beyond basic survival needs. That seems like extraordinary return on an $8 investment. What do you actually want from this arrangement? Not to die in a swamp, Celeste said flatly. Not to have my capabilities wasted because my appearance makes people uncomfortable. Beyond that, I'll determine what I want once I understand what's possible. The answer was careful, revealing ambition, while not specifying its scope in ways that might trigger defensive reactions. Augustine turned back to face her. You'll work in the study, mornings only to start. You'll maintain records, handle correspondence, and analyze any problems I assign. You'll continue sleeping in the isolation cabin that prevents complications with the house staff. Jacques will bring your rations directly rather than having you interact with other workers. If you perform adequately, we'll expand your responsibilities. If you create problems or fail to deliver value, you'll return to field work immediately. Clear. Clear, Celeste agreed. One more thing, Augustine added, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. I know you mentioned poison among your areas of knowledge. If you ever attempt to use that knowledge against me or anyone at Bellwood, I will have you burned again, slowly this time, over days rather than minutes. The scars you carry now will seem like decoration compared to what I'm capable of inflicting. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, Celeste replied without hesitation. You're establishing that betrayal carries consequences severe enough to outweigh any benefit I might gain from it. That's rational deterrence. I respect clarity in threats more than I respect attempted kindness that conceals identical willingness to inflict harm. Good, then we have a functional arrangement. Over the following months, Celeste became indispensable to Bellwood's operations in ways that neither she nor Augustine had fully anticipated. She reorganized the entire record-keeping system, implementing new procedures that made embezzlement virtually impossible, while also providing real-time visibility into productivity across different sections of the plantation. She identified inefficiencies in the sugar refining process that, when corrected, increased yield by nearly 8% without additional raw material costs. She drafted correspondence that successfully negotiated more favorable terms with factors and suppliers. Her careful attention to psychological manipulation through word choice and information revelation proving remarkably effective. She even solved a persistent problem with the steam engine that powered the sugar mill, diagnosing a governor calibration issue that had been causing irregular power delivery, and recommending adjustments that improved reliability significantly. Augustine watched this performance with growing appreciation that mixed professional admiration with something more complex. Celeste worked with focused intensity that suggested she viewed every task as life or death, which in a sense it was. Failure meant return to the fields and eventual death from exhaustion or accident. But there was also something almost artistic in how she approached problems, a elegance in her solutions that went beyond mere competence into genuine creativity. The household staff's initial horror at her presence gradually shifted to wary acceptance, as they realized she had no interest in disrupting their domains or competing for Augustine's attention in ways that might threaten their positions. The overseers remained hostile, particularly Jacques, who saw Celeste's influence as undermining his authority, even though she never gave him direct orders or contradicted his decisions publicly. Other planters who visited Bellwood and occasionally glimpsed Celeste in the study reacted with everything from disgust to fascination, unable to categorize what they were seeing. A hideously scarred slave woman doing complex administrative work created cognitive dissonance that some resolved by deciding Augustine was eccentric or possibly insane, while others concluded something improper must be happening, though they couldn't quite articulate what they suspected. Rumors spread throughout Ascension Parish. Some claimed Augustine had taken Celeste as a mistress, though her appearance made this explanation seem unlikely to anyone who actually saw her. Others suggested he was conducting some kind of experiment, testing whether educated slaves would be more or less manageable than ignorant ones. A few whispered about witchcraft, claiming Celeste had used supernatural means to cloud Augustine's judgment. Augustine ignored all speculation with the aristocratic disdain of someone who considered public opinion irrelevant, as long as profits continued increasing. It was in late autumn of 1848, almost exactly 1 year after purchasing Celeste, that their relationship shifted from purely transactional to something far more dangerous. Augustine had been reviewing quarterly financial reports, noting with satisfaction that Bellwood's profitability had increased nearly 20% since implementing changes Celeste had recommended. She was working at her small table near the window, updating inventory records in her precise handwriting, when he spoke without looking up from his papers. "You've paid for yourself many times over," he said. "The question now is what to do with you long-term. Your current arrangement is sustainable but inefficient. You could be more useful if you had broader authority, but granting that authority creates complications I'm not certain are manageable." "What complications specifically?" Celeste asked, setting down her pen. "Social complications, legal complications, practical complications related to the fact that you're remarkably intelligent but remain legally my property with no rights or protections beyond my willingness to extend them. That creates instability, because I have to constantly expend energy ensuring you don't become a threat while also trying to maximize your utility. What would stable look like from your perspective?" Augustine finally looked up, studying her with that analytical gaze that seemed to catalog every detail. "Honestly, I don't know. You represent a category problem that existing frameworks don't adequately address. You're too capable to waste on field labor, but using you for administrative work creates tensions with people whose cooperation I need. You're too intelligent to control through simple fear of punishment, but I can't offer you genuine freedom without destroying the entire social order I depend on. You're simultaneously an asset and a liability, and I haven't yet determined which predominates. Perhaps you're asking the wrong question, Celeste said carefully. Perhaps instead of asking how to control me or how to maximize my utility within existing frameworks, you should ask whether those frameworks actually serve your interests, or whether they're constraints you've accepted without examining whether they're necessary. Explain. You inherited Bellwood and the wealth it generates, Celeste said, choosing words with the precision of someone navigating a minefield. But you also inherited assumptions about how plantations must operate, about what relationships between master and slave must look like, about what's possible within the system. Those assumptions benefit some people enormously: the slave traders who profit from human commerce, the factors who take percentages of your sales, the overseers who maintain their positions through violence and fear. But do they actually benefit you, or do they just constrain what you could accomplish with different approaches? That sounds dangerously close to abolitionist rhetoric. It's not about morality, it's about efficiency. You're losing money and capability by accepting conventional wisdom about how to organize labor and authority. You could be making significantly more with significantly less effort if you were willing to experiment with structures that violate social expectations but produce better results. Give me an example. You pay Jacques $500 annually to oversee field operations, Celeste said. He maintains control through violence and fear, which generates minimum compliance while creating resentment and subtle forms of resistance that reduce productivity. You could instead offer field workers small wages or production bonuses tied to output, eliminating the need for an overseer entirely while increasing their motivation to work efficiently. The amount you'd pay in wages would be less than Jacques' salary, plus the productivity losses his methods create. That would require treating slaves as something other than property. It would require treating them as rational actors who respond to incentives, which they are regardless of their legal status. The current system forces you to pretend human beings are machines or animals, and that pretense creates inefficiencies because humans actually aren't machines or animals. They're motivated by complex calculations of self-interest that simple fear only partially addresses. Augustin leaned back in his chair, swirling brandy in his glass. And what would you want if I started experimenting with these alternative approaches? Celeste met his eyes directly. I would want you to recognize that the most dangerous constraint on Bellwood's potential isn't external. It's your own unwillingness to imagine what could be possible if you stopped accepting other people's definitions of how things must work. I would want you to see me not as property you own or as a problem you manage, but as someone whose interests could align with yours if you structured the relationship appropriately. That sounds remarkably close to suggesting partnership. I'm suggesting that you're currently fighting against capabilities I could offer freely if you gave me reasons to invest in Bellwood's success beyond simple fear of punishment. Fear motivates minimum compliance. Shared interest motivates innovation and genuine commitment. The silence that followed felt heavy with implications. Neither had yet spoken aloud. Just when you thought we'd seen every angle of this impossible relationship, the darkness deepens in ways that will challenge everything you thought you knew about power and survival. If this story is keeping you riveted, do me a favor, hit that like button to support this content. Share this video with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries, and drop a comment about what you think happens next. Let's keep uncovering these buried truths together. What you're describing, Augustin said finally, is fundamentally incompatible with the legal and social system we exist within. Even if I wanted to implement these changes, even if they were more efficient, the social costs would be enormous. Other planters would see it as threatening their own operations. Authorities would intervene if I strayed too far from accepted practices. Then the question is whether you're more interested in social acceptance or in maximizing what you can accomplish with the resources available to you, Celeste replied. Whether you value other planters' approval more than you value building something genuinely extraordinary that transcends conventional limitations. You're challenging me. I'm offering you a choice you probably didn't realize you had. You can continue operating Bellwood conventionally, earning good profits, maintaining social standing, and dying eventually having accomplished nothing particularly memorable. Or you can risk those things to create something unprecedented, to see what becomes possible when intelligence isn't wasted because of arbitrary social rules about whose capabilities deserve recognition. And if I choose the latter, what exactly are you proposing? That you start treating me as though my interests matter, as though my development and protection serve your objectives. That you give me authority proportional to my capabilities. That you restructure our relationship from owner-property to something resembling employer-employee, where my compensation is protection and opportunity rather than simple survival. That's not legally possible. Law is just codified power, Celeste said. It changes when people with sufficient power decide existing rules don't serve them anymore. You have enough power within Bellwood's boundaries to operate however you choose as long as you maintain profitability and don't create scandals that force external intervention. Augustin stood and walked to where Celeste sat, positioning himself close enough that most people would have found it intimidating. You realize you're essentially describing a form of slow revolution, he said quietly. You're suggesting I dismantle the assumptions that make plantation slavery function, not through moral objection, but through calculated self-interest. That's far more subversive than anything abolitionists propose. Is it working? Celeste asked, maintaining steady eye contact despite the proximity. Is what I'm proposing making you see possibilities you hadn't considered before? It's making me wonder whether you're the most valuable asset at Bellwood or the most dangerous thing I've ever allowed near me. Perhaps I'm both, and perhaps that's exactly what makes the arrangement interesting. The following months brought changes to Bellwood that confirmed Augustin had accepted at least some elements of what Celeste proposed. He fired Jack, citing general inefficiency rather than explaining his actual rationale, and implemented a modified labor system that paid small cash bonuses for production exceeding basic quotas. The change sparked exactly the controversy Celeste had predicted. With neighboring planters warning Augustin, he was creating dangerous expectations among enslaved workers and potentially inspiring resistance elsewhere. But productivity at Bellwood increased immediately and dramatically. Workers motivated by even minimal compensation proved far more efficient than those motivated purely by fear of punishment. Celeste's authority expanded accordingly. She began attending meetings with factors and suppliers, her analysis of market conditions and negotiating strategies proving so valuable that Augustin increasingly deferred to her judgment on commercial matters. She implemented new agricultural techniques she had researched through Augustin's extensive library, crop rotation patterns, and soil management practices that other Louisiana planters would not adopt for another decade. She even designed modifications to the sugar mill that improved efficiency enough to significant capital investment in new equipment. By mid-1849, Bellwood was generating profits that exceeded anything Augustin's father had achieved, while simultaneously requiring less violent coercion to maintain operations. The model was proving itself in the only terms that mattered to Augustin, financial returns. But success created new complications. Other planters began inquiring about Bellwood's methods, wanting to know how Augustin had achieved such remarkable improvements. He deflected these inquiries with vague references to better management and fortunate weather, But sustained curiosity inevitably would lead someone to discover Celeste's role. The social costs of that discovery were unpredictable but potentially catastrophic. Then in October 1849, 2 years after Celeste arrived at Bellwood, everything accelerated toward crisis in a way neither had anticipated. Augustine's cousin Philippe arrived from New Orleans, fleeing gambling debts and seeking temporary refuge while creditors cooled off. Philippe was everything Augustine was not, charming where Augustine was cold, impulsive where Augustine was calculating, carelessly cruel where Augustine's cruelty was at least purposeful. He had been at Bellwood less than a week when he encountered Celeste working in Augustine's study during one of his morning inspections. Philippe's reaction was immediate and visceral. "Christ, what is that abomination doing in your private study?" he demanded, his face twisted with revulsion. "You're letting something that looks like death itself handle your confidential business." "That is Celeste," Augustine replied without looking up from the contract he was reviewing. "She manages administrative operations because she's more competent than anyone else available." "You've lost your mind," Philippe said flatly. "That thing is cursed, probably contagious, definitely repulsive. Looking at her makes my skin crawl. How can you stand having her near you?" "I find competence more relevant than appearance," Augustine replied. "Now if you're finished critiquing my business practices, I have woe. Arcade to complete." But Philippe was not finished. He spent the next 2 weeks making Celeste's life miserable in ways that fell just short of provoking Augustine's direct intervention. Cruel comments about her appearance delivered just loudly enough for her to hear. Deliberate interference with her work, moving documents she needed, or rearranging materials to waste her time. Complaints to Augustine that her presence contaminated the household, that she probably carried disease, that she created an atmosphere of wrongness that made him uncomfortable in his own temporary home. Celeste endured this treatment with the same blank patience she applied to everything else, refusing to give Philippe the satisfaction of visible reaction. But Augustine noticed the way her jaw tightened when Philippe spoke, the way her hands stilled on whatever work she was doing until he left the room, the way her productivity suffered under the constant harassment. It came to a head on an afternoon in late October when Philippe, drunk and bored, decided to amuse himself by propositioning Celeste in front of the house staff. The comments were vulgar, designed to humiliate, suggesting that someone as hideous as her should be grateful for any attention regardless of how degrading. Several of the house staff laughed nervously, uncertain how to react to a white man of Philippe's social standing debasing himself by addressing a slave so directly. Celeste remained perfectly still, her face showing nothing. Then Philippe made the mistake of touching her, grabbing her arm to force her to look at him while he continued his performance. She moved faster than anyone expected, twisting free of his grip and stepping back with fluid precision that suggested training or at least extensive practice in avoiding unwanted contact. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice level but carrying an undertone of something dangerous. Philippe's face reddened with anger at being physically resisted by someone so far beneath him socially. He raised his hand to strike her. Augustine's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Philippe, step away from her now, or I will remove you from Bellwood by force, and you can face your creditors in New Orleans without my protection." Philippe spun to face his cousin, rage and humiliation fighting across his features. "You're defending that creature over your own blood, defending property over family." "I'm defending my business interests over your entertainment," Augustine replied coldly. "Celeste generates more value for this plantation in a single week than you've generated in your entire life. You're here because I tolerate your presence as a favor to your mother, my aunt. But that tolerance has limits, and you've just reached them. Pack your things. You're leaving today." The confrontation ended with Philippe's departure, and his bitter promises that everyone in New Orleans and throughout the parish would hear about Augustine's unnatural attachment to a disfigured slave. After he left, Augustine found Celeste in the study, still standing exactly where she had been during the confrontation. "You should have let him strike me," she said quietly. "Defending me against him will create exactly the kind of scandal you've been trying to avoid." "I didn't defend you," Augustine replied. "I defended my investment and my authority to manage my property as I see fit. There's a difference." "Is there?" Celeste asked, finally meeting his eyes. "Because from my perspective, you just chose me over family and social convention. That suggests this arrangement has become something other than purely transactional, whether you're willing to admit it or not." Augustine poured himself brandy with hands that were not entirely steady. "What it suggests is that I've allowed you to become too valuable to treat as disposable," he said. "That creates vulnerability that I find deeply uncomfortable." "What if vulnerability isn't weakness?" Celeste replied. "What if it's the price of accessing capabilities that conventional approaches can't reach? What if the very thing that makes this dangerous is also what makes it powerful?" The question hung between them, unanswered because answering would require acknowledging things neither was quite ready to speak aloud. Outside, the autumn afternoon faded toward evening, and somewhere in the distance, the sugar mill's steam whistle marked another day's work completed at Bellwood Plantation, where nothing was quite what it seemed, and where the rules everyone else followed had begun to bend in ways that would eventually break completely. Philippe's departure scattered poison throughout Ascension Parish like seeds on fertile ground. Within 2 weeks, every planter within 20 miles had heard some version of the story, each retelling amplifying the scandal, until fact became indistinguishable from speculation. Augustine Mercier had chosen a hideously disfigured slave over his own cousin. Augustine Mercier allowed this creature to handle confidential business matters, to work in his private study, to exercise authority that properly belonged to white overseers and managers. Augustine Mercier had become so obsessed with this abomination that he could no longer distinguish appropriate boundaries between master and property. The whispers carried different flavors depending on who was speaking. Some suggested sexual perversion, though Celeste's appearance made this explanation seem implausible to anyone who had actually seen her. Others proposed witchcraft or conjuring, claiming she had used African magic to cloud Augustine's judgment and control his will. A few, more perceptive or perhaps more honest, suggested that Augustine was conducting a deliberate experiment in plantation management that threatened to expose how much of the conventional system existed to serve overseers and factors' interests rather than actual plantation owners. This last interpretation was the most dangerous because it was closest to truth. The first direct challenge came in November 1849 when 3 neighboring planters, led by a man named Etienne Dufresne, who owned the property immediately adjacent to Bellwood's eastern boundary, requested a meeting with Augustine to discuss concerns about his management practices. The meeting took place in Bellwood's front parlor, a formal space that Augustine rarely used, but which served perfectly for this kind of confrontational encounter. Dufresne, a heavy-set man in his 50s who had inherited his plantation and managed it with the unimaginative brutality of someone following his father's methods without question, opened the conversation with elaborate courtesy that barely concealed underlying hostility. "Augustine, we come as neighbors and friends, concerned about certain irregularities at Bellwood that may affect all our operations." "Irregularities," Augustine repeated, his tone conveying skepticism about both the friendship claim and the concern's sincerity. "Reports suggest you've implemented unusual labor arrangements," Dufresne continued, "paying wages to slaves, reducing supervision, allowing excessive autonomy. These practices create dangerous expectations among workers throughout the parish. If slaves at Bellwood receive compensation, slaves elsewhere begin questioning why they don't receive the same treatment. "My labor arrangements are my business," Augustin replied. "Bellwood's profitability has increased substantially under current management. I fail to see how that creates problems for anyone except perhaps factors and overseers whose services become unnecessary under more efficient systems." You're also reported to have elevated a particular slave woman to positions of authority inappropriate for someone of her condition. The second planter interjected, a younger man named Bertrand whose nervous energy suggested he had been pressured into participating in this intervention. "People are talking, Augustin. They're saying you've lost perspective, that you're allowing improper attachment to cloud your judgment." "People talk about many things," Augustin said coldly. "Most of what they say reflects their own limitations rather than actual reality. I employ people based on capability, not on whether their appearance or status meets others' expectations. If you're uncomfortable with that approach, I suggest you focus on your own properties and leave me to manage mine." "It's not that simple," Dufresne said, his courtesy starting to crack. "What you do here affects all of us. The system we depend on requires maintaining clear boundaries between master and slave, white and black, authority and subjugation. When you blur those boundaries, you threaten the entire structure. We can't allow one man's eccentricity to endanger everyone's security." "Are you threatening me, Etienne?" "I'm warning you that continued deviation from acceptable practices will force us to take collective action. Economic pressure, social isolation, possibly involving state authorities if your experiments create instability that spreads beyond Bellwood's boundaries." Augustin stood, signaling the meeting's end. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare and your anxiety about social stability, but I'm not interested in conforming to expectations that serve your interests rather than mine. Bellwood operates profitably, maintains order and generates tax revenue that benefits the parish. If you attempt to interfere with my property or my business practices, you'll discover that I'm far less concerned with social acceptance than you imagine. Good day." The three planters left, their expressions suggesting the meeting had confirmed their worst fears about Augustin's mental state and intentions. Celeste, who had been working in the study during this exchange, and heard everything through the parlor's open door, found Augustin standing at the front window watching the men depart. "You just declared war on them," she observed. "I clarified that I won't be intimidated into abandoning practices that work in favor of practices that serve their convenience," Augustin replied. "Whether that constitutes war depends on their next actions. They'll escalate, they can't afford not to. What you're doing here threatens their entire worldview. If Bellwood succeeds while violating all their assumptions about how plantations must operate, it exposes how much of their system exists to benefit intermediaries rather than actual owners. They'll fight that revelation with everything available to them." "Let them fight," Augustin said. "I have resources, legal expertise, and most importantly, I have results that speak louder than their rhetoric. Bellwood's profits this year will exceed any plantation in the parish. That gives me leverage they can't easily overcome." "Unless they change the terms of engagement," Celeste said quietly. "Unless they stop competing on economic grounds and start attacking on social and legal grounds where your advantages matter less." "What would you suggest?" "Prepare for siege. Prepare for them to attempt isolating you economically and socially. Make alliances with people who benefit from your success, factors in New Orleans who get more commission from higher profits, merchants who sell you supplies, anyone whose interests align with Bellwood's continued prosperity. And prepare for the possibility that they'll attack me directly as the most visible symbol of everything they find threatening about your approach." "I won't allow them to harm you," Augustin said, then seemed surprised by his own vehemence. You're too valuable to Bellwood's operations to lose." "Is that the only reason?" Celeste asked, then immediately seemed to regret the question. "Forgive me, that was inappropriate." Augustin turned from the window to face her directly. "The honest answer is that I don't entirely know anymore. You were supposed to be a tool I used to increase efficiency. Instead, you've become something I can't quite categorize, someone whose perspective I've started valuing independent of its immediate utility. That concerns me because attachment creates leverage others can exploit." "Then perhaps we should discuss what happens if they do exploit that leverage," Celeste said. "What happens if they force a choice between me and everything else you've built here? Because that choice is coming, Augustin, probably sooner than either of us would prefer." The siege Celeste predicted began immediately. Factors in New Orleans who handled Bellwood's sugar sales started suggesting that Augustin might find better terms elsewhere, their polite language barely concealing pressure from other planters to reduce Bellwood's commercial access. Merchants in Donaldsonville, who supplied equipment and provisions, raised prices selectively, making Bellwood's operations more expensive while maintaining standard rates for other plantations. The parish newspaper, controlled by interests aligned with Dufresne and similar planters, ran several articles discussing the importance of maintaining traditional plantation management practices and the dangers of experimental approaches that undermined social stability. More subtly, but perhaps more dangerously, enslaved people from neighboring plantations started appearing at Bellwood's boundaries, having escaped their own situations and seeking the better conditions they had heard existed at the Mercier property. This was exactly the outcome other planters had feared. Bellwood's different approach was attracting runaways, creating enforcement problems that risked inspiring broader resistance. Augustin found himself handling these situations with increasing frustration. Louisiana law required him to return runaways to their legal owners or face criminal charges for harboring fugitives. But actually, enforcing that requirement meant participating in a system he had grown to despise, meant sending people back to conditions he knew were worse than what he offered at Bellwood, meant choosing legal compliance over moral consistency. It was during one of these incidents in December 1849 that Celeste proposed a solution that should have shocked Augustin, but instead felt almost inevitable. A young man named Marcus had appeared at Bellwood's northern boundary, bearing whip scars suggesting he had been punished severely and repeatedly on his previous plantation. He begged to be allowed to work at Bellwood, saying he had heard that Master Mercier paid wages and didn't beat his workers. Augustin was preparing to return him to his owner, a notoriously brutal planter named Gaston Leclerc, when Celeste intervened. "Don't send him back," she said quietly. "I have no choice. Louisiana law is explicit about harboring runaways." "Then change his status, make him no longer a runaway." "How exactly would I accomplish that magical transformation?" Celeste pulled out a blank bill of sale from Augustin's desk drawer. "You write to Leclerc offering to purchase Marcus for whatever price makes the transaction economically rational. Leclerc gets cash for a worker he clearly considers more trouble than he's worth. Marcus gets to stay here where he'll be treated better. You gain a worker who will be intensely loyal because you saved him from returning to hell. Everyone benefits except the abstract principle of property rights that you've already stopped believing in anyway. That will cost me money I don't particularly want to spend, and it establishes a precedent that I'm willing to purchase every runaway who appears here. Do you understand how quickly that becomes unsustainable?" "It becomes sustainable when those workers' productivity exceeds their purchase price," Celeste replied. "And it sends a message to other planters that you're willing to compete for labor using economic means rather than violence. That's threatening to them, which means it's working." Augustin stared at the blank bill of sale for a long moment. You're systematically dismantling everything I was raised to believe about how this system works, he said finally. I'm helping you see what you already knew but weren't ready to act on, Celeste corrected. That the system is neither inevitable nor optimal, that it persists because people benefit from not questioning it, and that you have enough power to create something different if you're willing to accept the costs. He bought Marcus from Leclerc for $200, twice what the young man was probably worth on the open market, but cheap enough that Leclerc accepted immediately, glad to be rid of a troublesome worker while making more profit than he would have through continued ownership. 3 more runaways appeared over the next 2 months. Augustin purchased all of them, establishing a pattern that infuriated neighboring planters, but which he could defend as legitimate business transactions rather than fugitive harboring. By early 1850, Bellwood's workforce had expanded by nearly 15 people, all of them intensely loyal to Augustin because he had saved them from worse situations, all of them working with extraordinary efficiency because they understood how precarious their improved circumstances were. But each purchase increased the economic pressure on Augustin. His liquidity was being drained faster than profits could replenish it. The other planters recognized this vulnerability and began exploiting it systematically, raising prices on everything Bellwood needed while simultaneously pressuring factors to delay payment for sugar shipments, creating a cash flow crisis that threatened to make the entire operation unsustainable. It was Celeste who identified the trap they were constructing and Celeste who proposed the radical solution that would ultimately transform everything. They're trying to force you into debt, she explained one evening in March 1850, reviewing financial projections that showed Bellwood approaching insolvency within 6 months despite continued operational profitability. Once you're vulnerable, they'll offer loans with conditions that let them control your management practices. They'll use your own success against you to force conformity. How do I prevent that? You need access to capital that doesn't come from Louisiana sources, Celeste said. You need investors who benefit from Bellwood's unconventional approach rather than feeling threatened by it. Abolitionists in the North who would see this as a proof of concept for how economic incentives could replace slavery. Progressive businessmen who care more about return on investment than social conformity. I can't approach Northern abolitionists for funding without committing social suicide in Louisiana, Augustin objected. Even talking to them would be considered treasonous by most planters here. Then you don't talk to them directly, Celeste replied. You find intermediaries who can facilitate investment without revealing your identity. You structure arrangements where Northern capital flows to Bellwood through entities that appear to be conventional business transactions. You're describing money laundering and conspiracy with political enemies. I'm describing survival through adaptation, Celeste corrected. You've already crossed the line that separated you from conventional planters. Now you need to fully commit to the other side or accept defeat and watch everything you've built here get destroyed by people whose interests require maintaining the status quo. Augustin walked to the window, looking out at Bellwood's grounds where evening work shifts were ending, and people were returning to quarters where they lived better than slaves on neighboring plantations, but still far worse than any free people. If I do this, he said quietly, if I bring in Northern capital and create alliances with abolitionists, I become exactly what Dufresne and others have been accusing me of being. A traitor to Southern interests, someone undermining the plantation system from within. You were already that, Celeste replied. You've been undermining it since the day you decided my capabilities mattered more than my appearance or legal status. The only question now is whether you're willing to be honest about what you've become. And what have I become? Someone who recognizes that slavery is economically inefficient and morally indefensible. Someone who has started building an alternative even though doing so threatens everything you've ever known. Someone who, whether you admit it or not, sees me as human rather than as property. The last statement hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that went far beyond business strategy or political positioning. Augustin turned to face her, and for the first time since she had arrived at Bellwood, he looked at her without any trace of the analytical detachment that usually characterized his gaze. "Is that what you are to me now?" he asked quietly, "human rather than property?" Celeste held his gaze steadily, the scarred left side of her face catching lamplight in ways that emphasized every irregular contour, while her unscarred right side showed features that were striking in their clarity and intelligence. "That's what I've always been," she replied. "The question is whether you're finally ready to acknowledge it publicly, with all the consequences that acknowledgement carries." "What would those consequences be?" "Social ostracism, economic retaliation, possibly violence from planters who see you as threatening their entire way of life, legal challenges to your property rights and business practices, the end of any possibility that you could ever be accepted in Louisiana plantation society again. And if I'm willing to accept those consequences, then we stop pretending this is just about efficient plantation management," Celeste said, her voice steady despite the weight of what she was proposing. "Then we acknowledge that what we're actually doing is building something genuinely revolutionary, something that demonstrates the entire slavery system can be replaced with arrangements that work better for everyone except the small number of people who profit from human trafficking and misery." "You realize what you're asking me to risk." "I realize what I'm offering you the chance to become," Celeste corrected. "Not just another wealthy planter who dies having accomplished nothing except accumulating money, but someone who actually changed something fundamental, who proved that the system everyone claims is inevitable and natural is actually neither of those things." Augustin reached up and touched the scarred side of her face, a gesture so unexpected that Celeste flinched slightly before forcing herself to remain still. "Does this hurt?" he asked quietly. "Not physically, not anymore. The nerve damage means I don't feel much sensation there. But it hurt when it happened. More than I have words to describe, yes. And yet you survived it. You turned yourself into someone formidable enough to stand here proposing revolution to a plantation owner, who by all rights should terrify you." "Fear is just one calculation among many," Celeste replied. "And I calculated long ago that the only thing more terrifying than risking everything would be wasting my entire life being too afraid to risk anything at all." They stood close enough that Augustin could see the way lamplight reflected in her eyes, one slightly narrowed by scarring and one wide open, both showing intelligence and determination that made her appearance seem increasingly irrelevant compared to the force of her presence. "If we do this," he said slowly, "if we fully commit to what you're proposing, there's no going back. We become enemies of the entire social order we've known our entire lives." "Then perhaps we should discuss what comes after," Celeste replied. "What we build once we accept that the old order has become untenable." "What would you want from this new order we'd be creating?" "I want to be free," Celeste said simply. "Not just in the sense of legal manumission, though that matters, but free in the sense of being treated as fully human, as someone whose capabilities and choices and desires are respected regardless of my appearance or my history. I want to build something that proves that people like me, people the system considers worthless or abominable, are actually capable of extraordinary things when given opportunity instead of degradation." "And what would I be in this new order?" "Whatever you choose to be," Celeste replied. "My partner in building something unprecedented. My employer in a relationship based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. Or, if you're willing to be truly honest about what's been developing between us despite every social rule and practical reason why it shouldn't, something more than either of those things." The kiss, when it happened, was Augustin who initiated it, but Celeste who deepened it. both of them crossing a line that would make everything that had come before seem like preparation for this moment. When they separated, both were breathing hard, both looked slightly shocked. By their own actions. "That changes everything," Augustin said unnecessarily. "That made explicit what was already true," Celeste corrected. "We've been moving toward this since the day you gave me work beyond digging ditches, since the first time you defended me against Philippe, since every moment you chose to see me as human rather than as the monster everyone else sees. The other planters will call this proof of exactly what they've been accusing me of," Augustin said. "They'll say you seduced me, that you used witchcraft or sexual manipulation to corrupt my judgment." "Let them think that," Celeste replied. "Let them believe I'm dangerous and powerful and capable of corrupting masters who get too close. That fear serves our purposes better than any truth would." "You're terrifying," Augustin said, but he was smiling when he said it. "I'm practical," Celeste corrected. "And I'm telling you that if we're going to survive what comes next, we need to stop fighting on their terms and start creating our own rules entirely." Over the following months, they did exactly that. Augustin made contact through intermediaries with abolitionist networks in Philadelphia and Boston, carefully structuring investment arrangements that brought Northern capital to Bellwood, while maintaining plausible deniability about the political nature of these alliances. The investments were presented as purely commercial ventures, backing an innovative agricultural operation that generated exceptional returns. That the operation also demonstrated how wage labor could replace slavery was never mentioned explicitly, but everyone involved understood the implications. The capital infusion stabilized Bellwood's finances and allowed Augustin to expand operations while maintaining the modified labor system that had proven so effective. More runaways appeared, and Augustin purchased everyone whose former owner was willing to sell, gradually building a workforce that was partly enslaved and partly free, but all compensated through wages or profit-sharing arrangements that aligned their interests with Bellwood's success. Productivity continued increasing. Profits reached levels that made Bellwood unquestionably the most successful plantation in Ascension Parish despite all the economic pressure being applied against it. And the relationship between Augustin and Celeste evolved from professional partnership into something that defied every social category available to describe it. They worked together daily, Celeste's authority now explicit rather than hidden. They ate meals together, discussing plantation business and philosophy and literature with the ease of intellectual equals. And they became lovers, though that term seemed inadequate for a relationship that combined genuine affection with strategic partnership and political conspiracy in ways that made simple categorization impossible. Celeste moved from the isolation cabin to a room in the main house, a transition that should have created scandal, but which Augustin simply announced, without offering explanation or tolerating discussion. The household staff adapted because they had no choice, though their discomfort remained visible in every interaction. The relationship remained physically intimate but never quite domestic, both Augustin and Celeste maintaining a certain careful distance even in private, as though fully relaxing into conventional partnership would somehow weaken the revolutionary potential of what they were creating. By the summer of 1850, Bellwood had become something unprecedented in Louisiana plantation society. An operation that was nominally still a slave plantation, but functioned increasingly like an experimental collective where labor was compensated. Decisions were made collaboratively, and the traditional boundaries between master and slave had become so blurred as to be nearly meaningless. Other planters watched this transformation with horror and fascination, unable to decide whether to admire Bellwood's profitability or condemn its methods. The tension between these impulses would eventually have forced some kind of resolution, but external events intervened to accelerate everything toward crisis. In August 1850, Etienne Dufresne died suddenly, his body discovered in his study with no obvious cause except for some discoloration around his mouth that suggested possible poisoning. The death was investigated superficially and ruled natural, probably a heart seizure or stroke, but rumors immediately began circulating that Augustin had ordered the killing to eliminate opposition to Bellwood's unconventional practices. These rumors gained credibility when two other planters who had been vocal critics of Augustin's management style died within the following 6 months, one from a riding accident that might have involved a deliberately spooked horse, and another from what appeared to be contaminated food that caused violent illness culminating in death. No evidence directly connected these deaths to Bellwood or to anyone associated with the plantation, but the pattern was suspicious enough that state authorities began making inquiries. Augustin maintained complete innocence, expressing appropriate condolences and pointing out that he had no motive for killing people whose objections to his practices had no practical effect on Bellwood's operations. But privately, in conversations with Celeste that took place late at night when no one else could overhear, he confronted her directly about whether she had taken actions without his knowledge or permission. The conversation happened in his bedroom in November 1850, after the third planter's death had been announced. "Did you kill them?" he asked without preamble. "Dufresne and the others, did you poison them or arrange accidents to eliminate opposition?" Celeste, who had been reading by lamplight, set down her book and looked at him with an expression that revealed nothing. "Does it matter whether I did?" "Of course it matters. 3 men are dead. 3 men who were actively working to destroy everything we've built here," Celeste replied calmly. 3 men who would have succeeded eventually if they had lived long enough to coordinate effective opposition. Their deaths were convenient for our purposes. Does it actually matter whether those deaths were natural or assisted? "It matters because murder is a line we haven't crossed," Augustin said. "It matters because if you're killing people without my knowledge, it means I don't actually control what happens at Bellwood anymore." "You never controlled what happens here," Celeste replied. "You influenced it, shaped it, made decisions that affected outcomes. But control is an illusion masters tell themselves to feel secure in their authority. The truth is that everyone with any intelligence exercises agency in whatever ways their circumstances permit, and you gave me enough authority that my agency became very extensive indeed." "That's not an answer to my question." "The answer to your question is that I'm not going to confirm or deny actions that, if acknowledged, would put both of us at risk legally and strategically. What I will tell you is that I have consistently prioritized Bellwood's survival and our shared objectives over any sentimental attachment to people who threaten those objectives. If that troubles you, perhaps you should examine whether you truly understood what you were building when you gave me power." The response should have horrified him, should have forced immediate confrontation and demands for complete honesty, regardless of strategic considerations. Instead, Augustin found himself asking a different question entirely. "If you did kill them, were you protecting Bellwood or protecting yourself?" "Both," Celeste replied, "because at this point the two have become essentially indistinguishable. What threatens Bellwood threatens me. What destroys this operation destroys my only chance at a life worth living. So yes, if I took actions to eliminate threats, I did so for both our benefits simultaneously." They stood in silence for a long moment, the lamplight casting shadows that made the room seem like a space outside normal reality where different rules applied. Finally, Augustin spoke again. "I don't know whether I should be terrified of you or grateful to you." "Perhaps both," Celeste suggested. "Perhaps that's exactly the appropriate response to someone who has become powerful enough to act independently while remaining committed enough to shared objectives that those independent actions serve mutual interests. "You've become dangerous," Augustin said, but there was something almost like pride in his voice when he said it. "I've become effective," Celeste corrected. "Danger is just effectiveness that makes people uncomfortable." Outside, November rain hammered against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness beyond Bellwood's boundaries, forces were gathering that would soon test whether effectiveness would be sufficient to survive the storm that was coming. The state investigation began in January 1851. A magistrate named Armand Roussel arrived from Baton Rouge with authority to examine the circumstances surrounding the three planters' deaths, and to assess whether criminal activity had occurred at or originating from Bellwood Plantation. Roussel was a careful man, methodical in ways that suggested he had survived Louisiana's political corruption by being too thorough to bribe and too precise to threaten. He spent 2 weeks interviewing everyone at Bellwood, examining financial records, and reviewing correspondence that might indicate motive or opportunity for the deaths he was investigating. His attention focused quickly on Celeste. Her presence at Bellwood violated every social convention about appropriate relationships between masters and slaves. Her obvious intelligence and authority created suspicion about undue influence, and her knowledge of poisons, which several witnesses mentioned, made her an obvious suspect for deaths that increasingly appeared deliberate rather than accidental. The interview took place in Bellwood's formal parlor with Augustin present as her legal owner, though Roussel's questions were directed at Celeste with an intensity that suggested he viewed her as more than simple property. "You understand chemistry and pharmacology," Roussel said, reviewing notes he had compiled from other interviews. "Multiple witnesses report you discussing medicinal properties of various plants and compounds. You've treated illnesses among the workers here, prescribed remedies, prepared tinctures and decoctions." "I've studied what I could learn from books in Master Mercier's library," Celeste replied, her voice carefully neutral. "When people are sick and no doctor is available, someone must provide treatment or watch them die. I chose to provide treatment. And you understand that many medicinal compounds become poisonous at higher doses, that the difference between cure and kill is often just a matter of quantity." "I understand many things," Celeste said. "Understanding something and applying it for criminal purposes are very different matters." Roussel leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp and evaluating. 3 men who opposed Master Mercier's unconventional management practices died within 6 months, all under circumstances that could be consistent with poisoning or deliberate accident. You had motive. The deaths benefited you directly by eliminating people who wanted you removed from positions of authority. You had knowledge and access to means, and you have demonstrated remarkable capability for someone in your legal position, suggesting you're far more formidable than your status would indicate." "Are you accusing her of murder?" Augustin interjected coldly. "I'm establishing that she had opportunity and motive," Roussel replied without looking away from Celeste. "Whether that constitutes accusation depends on what else I discover. But I want to be very clear with you, Mademoiselle, if that's even the appropriate term. I believe you're involved in these deaths. I believe you're dangerous in ways most people haven't recognized because they're too distracted by your appearance to notice your actual capabilities. The question is whether I can prove it sufficiently to bring charges." Celeste held his gaze steadily, and in that moment Roussel saw something in her eyes that confirmed his suspicions, even without confession or evidence. Intelligence, yes, but also calculation and absolute ruthlessness. The look of someone who had decided long ago that survival justified any action and who had stopped bothering with moral qualifications that might constrain effectiveness. "You can't prove something that didn't happen," she said finally. "And even if you could prove it, you'd face the challenge of convincing Louisiana courts to prosecute a slave for killing white men at her master's direction. because that's the only framework that makes legal sense of this situation. Either I acted independently, in which case I'm just property that malfunctioned and Augustin bears responsibility for failing to control his property, or I acted under his orders, in which case he's the principal, and I'm merely the instrument. Either way, your investigation doesn't have a clear target that legal frameworks can address. Rousel sat back, his expression showing grudging respect for the logic she had just outlined. That's remarkably sophisticated legal reasoning. I read the law books in Master Mercier's library along with everything else, Celeste replied. I know exactly what I am under Louisiana statute, know exactly what protections and vulnerabilities that status creates. You're trying to fit me into categories that don't exist, trying to prosecute someone who isn't quite human under your legal definitions, but also isn't quite property given how I actually function here. The magistrate turned his attention to Augustin. You understand that if I conclude you ordered these killings, you'll face capital charges regardless of who actually administered the poison or arranged the accidents. I understand Louisiana law, Augustin replied. I also understand that you have no evidence connecting me or anyone at Bellwood to these deaths beyond your suspicions and the convenient timing. Suspicious circumstances aren't proof of criminal activity, and 3 deaths over 6 months in a parish of several dozen planters, many of whom are elderly or engage in risky behaviors like excessive drinking and reckless riding, hardly constitutes a pattern requiring criminal conspiracy to explain. Perhaps not, Rousel agreed, but I'm recommending continued observation of Bellwood's operations and particularly of the unusual relationship between you and this woman. If additional deaths occur among people who oppose your practices, my recommendations will become considerably less charitable. He left shortly after, his investigation technically inconclusive, but his suspicions unambiguously stated. After his departure, Augustin and Celeste remained in the parlor, both processing the implications of how close they had come to criminal prosecution. He knows, Augustin said quietly. He knows you killed them even if he can't prove it. Knowing and proving are different things, Celeste replied. And even if he proves it eventually, by then we'll have built something strong enough to survive accusations. That's always been the strategy. Move fast enough that opposition can't organize effectively, build success that makes our methods seem justified in retrospect, create a situation where prosecuting us would require dismantling something too valuable to destroy. How many more will die? How many more people will you kill to protect what we're building here? As many as necessary, Celeste said without hesitation. I didn't survive 23 years of being treated as abominable only to let conventional morality prevent me from building something unprecedented. Every person who died was actively working to destroy us. They chose opposition knowing the risks, and I eliminated threats before those threats could eliminate us. That's not murder, Augustin, that's war. The response should have ended their relationship immediately. Should have forced Augustin to recognize that Celeste had become someone capable of killing with calculation and without apparent remorse, someone whose commitment to their shared objectives had crossed lines he hadn't consciously authorized crossing. Instead, he found himself asking the question that revealed how thoroughly his own moral framework had been transformed by their partnership. Will you kill me if I become inconvenient? Celeste looked at him for a long moment, her scarred face showing emotions that the twisted tissue couldn't quite express properly, but which her eyes conveyed clearly enough. No, she said finally, because you're not an obstacle to overcome, you're the person who made me possible. Whatever I've become, whatever I'm capable of, exists only because you chose to see me as human when everyone else saw a monster. I may be ruthless about protecting that, may be willing to kill anyone who threatens it, but I won't destroy the person who created the only context in which I've ever been treated as having value. That's reassuring in a deeply disturbing way. Welcome to moral complexity, Celeste replied with something that might have been a smile if the scarring hadn't pulled her mouth into permanent asymmetry. Welcome to understanding that good and evil are less relevant categories than effective and ineffective, sustainable and unsustainable. You've been living in this moral territory for months now. You just hadn't fully acknowledged it until Rousel forced explicit recognition. They continued operating Bellwood with the strange combination of revolutionary social practice and ruthless pragmatism that had become their trademark. The plantation's profitability continued increasing even as social isolation became more complete. Other planters stopped visiting entirely, merchants raised prices to punishing levels, and Bellwood existed increasingly as an island of different rules surrounded by hostile territory that waited for opportunity to destroy what it couldn't understand. The opportunity came in March 1851, though not in any form either Augustin or Celeste had anticipated. Augustin collapsed while inspecting the sugar mill, a sudden illness that left him unconscious and unresponsive. The doctor summoned from Donaldsonville diagnosed apoplexy, a stroke that had damaged significant portions of his brain and left his survival uncertain. For 3 days he lingered between life and death, while Celeste maintained operations at Bellwood with the same efficient competence she had always demonstrated. On the 4th day, Augustin died. He was 34 years old. The official cause of death was recorded as natural, resulting from the stroke and its complications. But Rousel, still monitoring Bellwood from a distance, immediately suspected otherwise. The timing was too convenient, occurring precisely when Augustin's protection was the only thing preventing Celeste's vulnerability, precisely when his death would transfer control of Bellwood to someone who would inevitably sell off assets, including particularly problematic slaves like the disfigured woman who had wielded such inappropriate authority. Rousel returned to Bellwood within days of the death, demanding to examine the body before burial and to review any medications or treatments Celeste had administered during Augustin's final illness. What he discovered was technically inconclusive but practically damning. Traces of compounds in Augustin's system that could have resulted from legitimate medical treatment, but which at higher concentrations would have caused exactly the symptoms that preceded his death. Celeste's detailed records of treatments administered, so meticulous I seemed almost designed to provide cover rather than actual documentation. And most telling, a will that Augustin had executed just 2 weeks before his death, a will that deviated dramatically from Louisiana's normal inheritance patterns. The will left Bellwood entirely to a trust controlled by Northern investors who had been backing the plantation's operations. More specifically, it left operational control to those investors with explicit instructions that the plantation be managed according to the experimental labor practices Augustin had pioneered, and that Celeste be retained in her current position with authority to continue the administrative and technical work she had been performing. Most remarkably, the will included provisions for Celeste's manumission, her freedom to be purchased from Augustin's estate at nominal cost by the trust, and her continued employment at substantial wages as Bellwood's primary manager under the investor's nominal oversight. It was a brilliant legal construction that effectively gave Celeste control of Bellwood, while maintaining appearances that white Northern investors held ultimate authority. Rousel studied the will with the expression of someone who recognizes they've been outmaneuvered, but can't quite identify the specific deception that accomplished it. "This is convenient," he said to Celeste during their final interview. "Almost impossibly convenient that Master Mercier would execute a will protecting your position precisely weeks before dying under circumstances that might be consistent with poisoning. Master Mercier understood that opposition to our work here would intensify after his death," Celeste replied calmly. He structured his affairs to ensure Bellwood's experimental practices could continue regardless of what happened to him personally. That's called foresight, magistrate, not evidence of murder. You killed him, Rousel said flatly. I don't know how I'll ever prove it, but I know you did. You killed 3 planters who opposed you, and then you killed the one person whose death would give you everything you wanted: freedom, authority, control over a major plantation, vindication of every claim you made about your capabilities. If I killed Augustin Mercier, Celeste replied, her voice steady and her eyes showing no trace of guilt or shame, I would have destroyed the only person who ever treated me as human, the only person who saw past my appearance to recognize my actual value. That would make me monstrous in ways that even people who call me Abomination haven't imagined. So I'll ask you directly, magistrate, do you truly believe I'm that kind of monster? Or do you simply need to believe it because the alternative, that I'm innocent and you can't prove otherwise, leaves you powerless to stop what's happening here? Rousel stared at her for a long moment, then gathered his papers and stood to leave. I'll be watching Bellwood, he said. Any irregularities, any additional deaths, anything that suggests criminal activity, and I'll bring charges regardless of how difficult they are to prove. You may have escaped prosecution this time, but you won't escape scrutiny. I never expected to escape scrutiny, Celeste replied. People like me are always scrutinized, always suspected, always presumed guilty until circumstances force acknowledgement of innocence. I've lived under that scrutiny my entire life, magistrate. I've learned to work within it rather than being constrained by it. After Rousel left, Celeste stood alone in Bellwood's study, the room where she had first demonstrated her capabilities to Augustin, where they had planned revolution disguised as plantation management, where they had become partners and lovers and co-conspirators in building something that violated every rule governing the world they inhabited. The truth about Augustin's death, the truth she would never speak aloud to anyone, was more complex than Rousel's suspicions suggested. She had not poisoned him deliberately. But when the stroke occurred, when she had the opportunity to administer treatments that might have saved him or allow him to die through carefully calibrated neglect, she had made a calculation. Augustin alive meant continued protection, but also continued limitation. She would always be his property legally, even if treated as partner practically, would always be vulnerable to his decisions, would always be dependent on his willingness to maintain their revolutionary arrangement. Augustin dead, with proper preparation through the will and the Northern investors' involvement, meant genuine freedom, meant authority that came through contractual employment rather than master's discretion, meant the possibility of building something even more radical than what they had created together. She had loved him, in whatever complicated way love could exist between people whose relationship began with ownership and evolved into partnership. But she had also understood that love was less important than survival. That sentiment couldn't be allowed to prevent necessary choices, that the work they had started together could continue without him, and perhaps flourish more fully without the constraints his presence as a white male property owner inevitably imposed. So she had let him die, adjusting treatments in ways that ensured death would come quickly rather than lingering, that his suffering would be minimal, that his departure would create maximum benefit for the objectives they had shared. It was murder, technically, if withholding life-saving treatment while providing comfort care to ease death constituted killing. But it was also mercy, sparing him the slower death that would have come from continued strokes, and it was strategy, recognizing that his death at this precise moment created opportunities that might never come again. Standing in the study, surrounded by books and papers and all the material evidence of their collaboration, Celeste allowed herself one moment of genuine grief for the person who had changed her life by recognizing her humanity. Then she returned to work, because grief was an indulgence that accomplished nothing, and there was an extraordinary amount to accomplish. The transition period following Augustine's death lasted nearly a year. The Northern investors, abolitionists who saw Bellwood as proof that wage labor could replace slavery profitably, provided capital and legal protection while Celeste managed day-to-day operations. Her manumission was formalized, her freedom purchased for the nominal sum of $1 as Augustine's will had specified, and she was officially employed as Bellwood's manager at wages that made her one of the highest-paid people in Ascension Parish regardless of race. The arrangement infuriated local planters, but fascinated observers from outside Louisiana. Journalists from northern newspapers visited to document this unprecedented experiment, where a formerly enslaved woman managed a major plantation. Abolitionists held up Bellwood as evidence that slavery could be ended without economic catastrophe. Even some progressive Southerners began quietly inquiring whether similar arrangements might be viable on their own properties. Celeste expanded the wage labor system, gradually purchasing freedom for most of Bellwood's remaining enslaved workers and converting them to paid employees. Production increased rather than decreased under this arrangement. Workers motivated by compensation and the possibility of eventually purchasing their own small plots of land proved far more effective than those motivated purely by fear. By 1855, Bellwood was operating almost entirely on free labor, a transformation that should have been impossible in Louisiana, but which succeeded through combination of economic success and Celeste's ruthless elimination of obstacles. 3 more planters who opposed Bellwood's practices died during this period, though Rousseau could never prove direct connection to Celeste despite his continued surveillance. The deaths might have been coincidental, might have been natural, or might have been evidence that Celeste had developed networks of people willing to act on her behalf in ways that maintained plausible deniability. The ambiguity was perhaps the point, creating atmosphere where opposing Bellwood carried risks that people couldn't quite define, but couldn't ignore either. In 1857, Celeste purchased Bellwood outright from the Northern investors who had been holding nominal ownership. The transaction was enabled by profits she had accumulated, as manager combined with loans from abolitionists who wanted to see a formerly enslaved woman owning a plantation as powerful symbol of what was possible. The purchase made her one of the few black women in the antebellum South to own major agricultural property, a status so extraordinary that it attracted attention from across the country. Some celebrated it as evidence of America's promise that anyone could rise regardless of circumstances. Others condemned it as violation of natural order and dangerous precedent that threatened the entire Southern social structure. Celeste ignored both celebration and condemnation, focusing instead on continuing the work Augustine had started and she had expanded. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, Bellwood employed over 200 people, almost all of them formerly enslaved and now working for wages. The plantation generated profits that exceeded anything achieved under traditional slavery, demonstrated conclusively that the economic arguments for slavery were false, that it persisted not because it was efficient, but because it served the interests of slave traders, overseers, and factors who profited from the system itself. The war, when it came, transformed Bellwood from controversial experiment into model for what freedom might look like. Union forces that occupied Louisiana in 1862 used Bellwood as example when establishing labor policies for newly freed slaves. Celeste worked with military authorities to implement wage labor systems across multiple plantations, sharing knowledge she had developed through years of experimentation. Her expertise made her valuable to Reconstruction efforts despite continued social prejudice about her race and appearance. After the war, Celeste continued operating Bellwood until 1875, when she sold the property and relocated to Philadelphia. She was 49 years old, wealthy beyond what anyone who had seen her standing on that auction block in 1847 could have imagined possible, and tired of fighting battles that should have been won decades earlier. In Philadelphia, she used her wealth to establish schools for black children and to support political organizing for civil rights. She never married, maintaining that she had already experienced the only partnership that interested her, and that everything after Augustine's death was just epilogue. She lived until 1893, dying at 67 years old, surrounded by people who knew her as formidable philanthropist and educator rather than as the abominable slave who had somehow become mistress of a plantation. Her obituary in the Philadelphia Tribune described her as pioneering businesswoman and civil rights advocate, whose early experiments in free labor plantation management had helped demonstrate the economic viability of ending slavery. What it did not mention, what could never be mentioned without destroying her reputation and legacy, was how many people had died to make those experiments possible. How many obstacles had been eliminated through poison or arranged accident. How many threats had been neutralized before they could fully materialize. How much of her success had been built not just on intelligence and determination, but on absolute ruthlessness in protecting the revolutionary arrangement she and Augustine had created. The sealed investigation file, the one Magistrate Rousseau had compiled but never been able to use for prosecution, remained in Louisiana State Archives. It documented suspicions about 7 deaths between 1849 and 1857 that appeared connected to Bellwood, detailed evidence of poison use and mechanical sabotage, and concluded that Celeste had almost certainly been responsible for multiple murders, but that proving it was impossible given her legal status and the protection provided by Northern investors. The file noted that she was perhaps the most dangerous person Rousseau had encountered in 20 years of law enforcement, not because she was violent in the conventional sense, but because she understood power so thoroughly that she could manipulate it with precision that made her actions seem either innocent or justified, depending on one's perspective. The file remained sealed for 70 years, finally opened in 1923, when historians researching Reconstruction discovered references to unusual plantation management practices at Bellwood. By then, Celeste had been dead for 30 years, beyond reach of either prosecution or judgment. The revelations in the file sparked debate about whether she should be remembered as freedom fighter, who did what was necessary to escape slavery and build alternatives, or as murderer who used progressive politics as cover for serial killing, motivated by personal ambition. The debate never reached consensus because the categories available couldn't adequately capture what Celeste actually represented. She was both victim and perpetrator, revolutionary and criminal, someone who had been denied humanity by society, and then proved her humanity through actions that violated every moral framework that society claimed to value. She had survived being marked as abominable by turning that designation into weapon, by becoming exactly as monstrous as people expected, while using that monstrousness to achieve objectives that transcended simple revenge. She had loved Augustin Mercier genuinely, while also recognizing when his death served her interests better than his survival. She had built something unprecedented and valuable, while eliminating anyone who threatened it with the same pragmatic efficiency she applied to improving crop yields or optimizing sugar refining processes. The mystery at Bellwood Plantation wasn't really about whether Celeste killed people. The evidence suggests strongly that she did. The mystery was about what moral frameworks can possibly judge someone whose entire existence was shaped by a system that defined her as property, as less than human, as abomination to be hidden or destroyed. Could murder be self-defense when the victim's stated intention was to force you back into slavery? Could calculated elimination of obstacles be justified as necessary resistance when the obstacles were people working to maintain your legal non-personhood? Could ruthlessness in pursuing freedom be condemned when society's alternatives were death through exhaustion or lifetime of degradation? These wherein abstract philosophical questions for Celeste. They were practical calculations about survival in a world that offered no good options, only choices between different forms of harm. She chose the harm that served her interests, chose to become dangerous rather than remain victim, chose to build something revolutionary even if building it required destroying people who stood in the way. Whether that makes her hero or monster depends entirely on whose perspective you value. The perspective of a system that required treating people as property to function, or the perspective of someone who recognized that system as fundamentally illegitimate and acted accordingly. What's undeniable is that she succeeded in ways that should have been impossible, transformed herself from $8 purchase considered worthless into owner of a major plantation, built a model for free labor that influenced post-war Reconstruction, and lived long enough to see at least partial vindication of the work she and Augustine had started. The cost of that success was measured in bodies, in compromised morality, in calculations that prioritized effectiveness over ethics. But perhaps that cost simply reflected the reality that revolutionary change has never been accomplished through pure virtue, that systems as deeply entrenched as slavery required opposition, willing to be as ruthless as the system itself. That freedom sometimes had to be taken through force, because it would never be granted willingly. The real horror at Bellwood wasn't supernatural, wasn't about curses or conjuring or any of the explanations people preferred to the truth. The real horror was how a system could mark someone as abominable because of burn scars, could define them as property because of skin color, could deny their humanity so completely that surviving required becoming exactly as monstrous as they were accused of being. The real horror was that Celeste's story, as extraordinary as it was, represented just one example of calculations thousands of people made daily under slavery, calculations about when violence became necessary, when mercy became unaffordable, when the only path to survival required crossing lines that could never be uncrossed. And perhaps the deepest horror was that even after slavery ended, even after Celeste died respected and wealthy, the fundamental questions her life raised remained unanswered. What do we owe people whose humanity has been systematically denied? How do we judge actions taken under conditions we've never experienced? What limits apply to resistance against systems that recognize no limits in their oppression? These questions echoed through the ruins of Bellwood Plantation long after the buildings fell into decay, long after the sugar fields returned to swamp, long after everyone who had known Celeste personally was gone. They echo still, waiting for answers that satisfy more than our need for comfortable moral categories that keep perpetrators and victims neatly separated, that allow us to condemn or celebrate without confronting the uncomfortable complexity of people who were simultaneously both. Celeste's legacy isn't just what she built or what she destroyed. It's the question she forced through her very existence, a question that remains as urgent now as it was when she stood on that auction block in 1847, marked as abominable, sold for $8, and began calculating how to transform herself from victim into something far more dangerous. What happens when people's society has tried to erase refuse to stay erased? What happens when those marked as monsters decide to become the monsters they were always accused of being? What happens when the abominable one refuses to accept that designation as final judgment, and instead turns it into revolution? At Bellwood Plantation, we learned one possible answer, written in profit margins and poison, in freedom purchased through blood, in a woman's face marked by fire who decided that surviving the flames meant learning to set fires of her own. What did you think of Celeste's journey from $8 slave to plantation owner? What do you think about the moral questions her story raises? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story captivated you, share it with someone who appreciates dark history that challenges comfortable narratives. Hit that like button. Subscribe to The Sealed Room for more buried stories that reveal uncomfortable truths. And remember, the most profound horrors aren't the ones that jump out at us. They're the ones we've learned not to see. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been told to accept.